New section, European Antisemitism. The term, quote, anti-Semitism first appeared in the 1870s in Germany at a time when the last remaining restrictions on Jewish civil rights had finally been removed. Jews now enjoyed equal civil and political rights and began to assume influential positions in politics, art, journalism, and science, and as attorneys, bankers, businessmen, and writers. These achievements correlated with the liberalization of capitalism and an unprecedented economic expansion. When, following victory over France in the War of 1870-71, an additional 5 billion French gold francs in war reparations flowed into Germany, economic optimism knew no bounds and free enterprise boomed. Thus in Prussia in the year of 1872, quote, twice as many joint stock companies were established as in the entire period from 1790 to 1867, among them 49 banks and 61 chemical firms, end quote. Then it all came crashing down. Quote, the world economic crisis of 1870 struck this optimistic, forward-striving, and wildly speculating empire like a flash of lightning, end quote, writes Paul W. Massing. Wikipedia says Paul Wilhelm Massing lived from 1902 to 1979 and was a German sociologist. I don't want to read Massing's whole biography. But it says in 1942 Massing worked at the Institute for Social Research at Columbia University in New York. In August 1942, Paul Massing notified NKVD that his friend Franz Neumann had recently joined the Office of Strategic Services. Massing reported to Moscow that Neumann had told him that he had produced a study of the Soviet economy for the Office of Strategic Services, Russian Department. In April 1943, Elizabeth Zerubina met with Neumann. Quote, parenthesis, Zerubina, in parenthesis, met for the first time with, parenthesis, Neumann, in parenthesis. He promised to pass us all the data coming through his hands. According to Neumann, he is getting many copies of reports from American ambassadors, and had access to materials referring to Germany, end quote. That's from the Verona file. From 1948 and for many years, Paul Massing taught political sociology at Rutgers in New Jersey. Paul Massing's most important work is Rehearsal for Destruction, a study of political anti-Semitism in Imperial Germany, which I suppose is what's being referred to here. Published in 1950, which was translated into German by Felix Weil and published in 1959, is Vorgeschichte des politischen Antisemitismus, Prehistory of Political Antisemitism, with a preface by Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno. In 1977, Paul Massing returned to Grumbach with Herta Herzog Massing, but had only 2 years to live. He is buried at the family plot at Grumbach. Back to the text. Quote, a stock market crash that wiped out many rapidly acquired fortunes and a vast quantity of hard-won small savings alike inaugurated an economic collapse. It ushered in one of the longest and most serious economic crises in German history, end quote. Paul W. Massing. Footnote. See Paul W. Massing for Geschichte des politischen Antisemitismus. The description for this book, which translates as Prehistory of Political Antisemitism in German, says, it is, quote, of the most importance that people in Germany learn that National Socialism is not an industrial accident on the highway of progressive humanity, but that the accident has something to do with the structure of this highway itself, end quote. Adorno on the significance of Massing's study and the timeliness of a German translation, January 23, 1959. Paul Massing's historical account of the emergence of political anti-Semitism in the German Empire, which was created as part of the research project on anti-Semitism by the Institute for Social Research that had emigrated to the USA, was first published in 1949 in the series Studies in Prejudice under the title Rehearsal for Destruction, and in 1959 in German translation by the European Publishing House. The strength of this pioneering study, which was praised at the time as groundbreaking, lies in the fact that Massing places the emergence of anti-Semitism in a political context, investigates the power relations of the time, and takes social and economic conditions into account. The significance of his study is also demonstrated by the fact that Massing highlights how the anti-Semitic potential shifted from the political movement to the interest groups of the bourgeoisie and middle class, and how precisely these social classes became the decisive actors of anti-Semitism. Back to the text and footnote. A scapegoat for the cadastre was sought and found. In the chaos of the next few years, liberalism, henceforth identified as, quote, Jewish, end quote, became the chosen culprit. The journalist Wilhelm Marr, who lived from 1819 to 1904, a man of the left who had never hidden his loathing of liberalism, saw the signs of the times. Wilhelm Marr's achievement consisted in transferring Jew hatred from Jew hatred's religious roots, quote, onto a post-religious foundation, end quote. And that quote's from an article by Johannes Heil, Anti-Judaism and Antisemitismus. Begriffe aus Bedeutung Stregger, published in Wolfgang Benz's edited volume Jahrbuch für Antisemitismusforschung. 6. Published in 1997. End footnote. In February 1879, Wilhelm Marr published a pamphlet that sold like hotcakes, running through 12 editions in its first year, entitled The Victory of Judaism over Germanism, considered from a non-religious perspective. In his very title, Marr distanced himself from traditional anti-Judaism. For Marr, the opposite of Jewry was no longer Christendom, but, quote, Germandom, end quote. Quote, race replaced religion. According to Wilhelm Marr, owing to their, quote, innate, end quote, characteristics and, quote, ethnic nature, end quote. The Jews cannot be integrated through either baptism or educational improvement. By designating them as, quote, Semites, end quote, parenthesis, and himself later as an, quote, anti-Semite, end quote, end parenthesis, Marr attempted to provide his racism with a scientific veneer. Trying to find a description of this victory of Judaism over Germanism book. Yeah, not really sciencing anything for it. Anyway, it was, of course, nonsense, since there are no Semites, only Semitic languages that differ from other linguistic groups, such as the Indo-European. Marr's racist construct of, quote, Semites, end quote, would, however, be adopted by the Nazis as the opposite of their equally racist construct of, quote, Aryans. And this is important, in my opinion, well, not just in my opinion, but a lot of people's opinion, because a lot of people, for instance, Edward Said, and I believe people like Malcolm X and others, when talking about anti-Semitism, says, "Oh, it's anti-Semitism, X group, Palestinians or Arabs or whoever are Semites." So there's no possibility of them being anti-Semitic. How could they be anti themselves? Which is like completely accepts that what anti that like what's the word, not accepts, uncritically accepts the conceptual framework of this of these bozos like Wilhelm Marr. And you'll try, and this is like a thing, and this is why like people, if you notice, like a lot of people, I'm not sure who initiated it. Might have been a Holocaust researcher. I can't remember who did it, who isn't responsible for it. But in like older text, you'll see anti-Semitism, and now when you see anti-Semitism, you'll see anti-Semitism, one word without a dash, and the reason for that is that it presupposes that there's this real thing called like the Semites, right? And they're against it, as opposed to like a world ideology, right? That kind of creates, mystifies, creates a mythic target of its frustrations with modernity, basically. So that's a very important idea, right? Is like not taking for granted the conceptual framework of the anti-Semite, I guess, is what is the idea there, right? Anyway, back to the text. It was, of course, nonsense, since there are no Semites, only Semitic languages, but differ from other linguistic groups, such as the Indo-European. Marr's racist construct of, quote, Semites, end quote, would, however, be adopted by the Nazis as the opposite of their equally racist construct of, quote, Aryans. At the same time, his paradigm of, quote, the recovery of Judaism over Germanism, end quote, Marr created a cliché that remains effective to this day, in which the fantasy of Jewish omnipotence is contrasted with the allegedly helpless impotence of non-Jews. Here, Marr skillfully appealed to the feelings of impotence engendered by the economic crisis creating an outlet for the pressure of ever-growing discontent by casting all the guilt and responsibility onto the Jews. Quote, the, quote, Jewish question, end quote, is a socio-political question, end quote, Marr answered in his tract. Quote, who was, in the vanguard of the destabilizing and socially corrupting boom that followed the Franco-German war? The Jews, end quote. Wilhelm Marr. One second. Just wanted to copy that paragraph down. Marr and the Anti-Semitic League that he founded would henceforth proceed to attribute any and every unwelcome event to the Jews. It was the Jews who were allegedly responsible for the collapse of traditional social structures, for exploitation and economic crises, and for disunity in periods of national weakness. So I want to copy this down too. Okay, back to the text. While some aspects of this anti-Semitism were already present in Christian anti-Judaism, the differences are of crucial importance. Anti-Judaism appears in religious guise. The Jew who converts to Christianity or Islam can survive. In contrast, racial anti-Semitism, by attributing immutable characteristics to Jews, closes this escape route. Second, the aversion anti-Judaism is restricted to everything specifically Jewish. In contrast, anti-Semites, quote, know, end quote, only that everything Jewish is evil. Not only that everything Jewish is evil, but that all evil is Jewish. Communism and Wall Street, materialism and destructive criticism. The key text of anti-Semitism is a forgery created by Jew haters that was first published in 1903, known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which attributes the responsibility for everything bad that happens in the world to international Jewry. A few decades later, this text would provide the motive for the Nazi Holocaust. If Jews were responsible for all the misery in the world, their annihilation was the only way to redeem that world. Let us return to Islamic anti-Semitism. Having first distinguished Islamic from Christian anti-Judaism, and second, anti-Judaism from anti-Semitism, we can now recognize what distinguishes Islamic anti-Semitism from all other forms of Jew hatred. Only here are the degrading anti-Judaism of early Islam and the conspiratorial anti-Semitism of modern times fused together. So long as under pre-modern conditions, Islam continued to adhere to traditional anti-Judaism, it was not anti-Semitic. This changed, however, in the course of the 20th century. Now Muslims begin to adopt the European Christian idea of the Jews as a, quote, cosmic evil, end quote. Henceforth, the most negative images of Jews from both Christianity and Islam were brought together, and the 20th century combined with the 7th. The traditional Islamic image of Jewish weakness and cowardice are linked with the Western conspiracy paranoia about Jews secretly pulling the strings. Here are two examples of this combination at work. New section, Sayyid Qutb, Our Struggle with the Jews. Sayyid Qutb, who lived from 1906 to 1966, was the most important ideologist of the Muslim Brotherhood, and in the second half of the 20th century, one of the most famous figures of the Muslim world. I have described Sayyid Qutb's importance for the development of Islamism elsewhere. Footnote. It's actually a footnote that I missed. Never mind. Sorry, I thought there was a German translation of Mar's book, but I'm not really finding a good description of that either. The other book that I'm looking for is Matthias Küntzel, Jihad and Jew Hatred, Islamism, Nazism, and the Roots of 9/11. And the description of this book says, Jihad and Jew Hatred, Islamism, Nazism, and the Roots of 9/11 traces the impact of European fascism and Nazism on the Arab and Islamic activists. Küntzel investigates the shift of global anti-Semitism from Nazi Germany to parts of the Arab world during and after World War II. He argues that anti-Semitism is not merely a supplementary feature of modern jihadism, but lies instead at its ideological core. This fascinating study lays bare the antecedents of the anti-Semitism that runs rampant in our world today. For anyone interested in exploring the mindset of hatred that led to the crimes in New York and Washington on September 11th, 2001, this book is a must-read. For readers interested in the history of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, this book is a challenge to think outside of a narrowly European context. For everyone, this book provides crucial insight into the roots of terror that continue to threaten us all. Back to the text. End footnote. Here we will concern ourselves solely with an essay he wrote at the start of the 1950s entitled Our Struggle with the Jews. In 1970, this key text of Islamic anti-Semitism was republished by the government of Saudi Arabia and disseminated through the Muslim world. Quote, the Jews, plotted against the Christian Muslim community from the first day it became a community, end quote. Qutb writes here, quote, this bitter war which the Jews launched against Islam, end quote. Qutb continues, quote, is a war which has not been extinguished even for one moment, for close on 14 centuries, end quote. Qutb. Quote, the struggle between Islam and the Jews continues in force and will thus continue because the Jews will be satisfied only with the destruction of this religion, parenthesis, Islam, end parenthesis, end quote. Footnote, see Ronald L. Nettler, Past Trials and Present Tribulations, a Muslim fundamentalist view of the Jews. The description of this book says, the emergence of Islamic fundamentalism has added a new theological dimension to Muslim-Jewish relations and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Past Trials and Past Tribulations examines the dimension from the perspective of the, quote, godfather, end quote, of Islamic fundamentalism, the Egyptian activist and writer Sayyid Qutb. The author provides a translation of and commentary on Qutb's essay titled Our Struggle with the Jews, explaining how Qutb applied ancient Islamic doctrine and experience to contemporary circumstances. This book is the first detailed textual study of an important document of modern Islamic fundamentalist thought on the Jews. Its focus upon the doctrinal dimension of the Middle Eastern conflict marks a significant departure from more usual political and military emphasis given to the subject. Okay. End footnote. Here Qutb has revised the Quran and rewritten the traditional history of Islam. While the Jews of Medina in reality had no chance against Muhammad and his companions, Qutb presents the Muslims as the victims and the Jews as the aggressors against Islam. In Qutb's mind, the particular local events of Medina became part of a global and bitterly conducted war that can end only with the destruction of one side or the other. The basic structure of this paranoid fantasy is the same as in National Socialism, with the difference that in the latter case it was Germany rather than Islam that the Jews were alleged to be bent on destroying. Hitler projected his own lust for destruction onto the Jews in order to legitimize his lust for destruction. Qutb took the same path 10 years later. Qutb makes the only fleeting mention of Hitler in his text. Qutb considers the Nazi efforts to destroy the Jews as a well-deserved and Allah-approved punishment that should now, with the creation of Israel, be followed by, quote, the worst kind of punishment, end quote. Unlike in the Quran, moreover, Qutb's image of the Jew is marked by racism. Qutb treats the Jews as a totalized collective marked by characteristics that have remained permanent for thousands of years. What matters to Qutb is the religious dimension of the dispute. Just as the Jews in Medina allegedly sought to disturb the Muslims and lead the Muslims astray, so now, Qutb claims, the Jews are undermining the adherence of Muslims to their faith. Qutb identifies such promoters of modernity as Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, and Emile Durkheim as the most important opponents of Islam, and then, quote, reveals, end quote, them to be Jews. Quote, behind the doctrine of atheistic materialism was a Jew. Behind the doctrine of animalistic sexuality was a Jew. And behind the destruction of the family and the shattering of sacred relationships in society was a Jew, end quote. Qutb's Jew hatred thus turns out to be a war cry against the intellectual achievements of modernity. This is also evident from his redefinition of the concept of, quote, the Jew, end quote. While in the past the boundaries between Muslims and Jews have been clear-cut, and Jews who converted to Islam could be reasonably confident of their security, Qutb systematically erased these boundaries. Quote, anyone who leads this community away from its religion and its Quran can only be a Jewish agent, end quote. Qutb writes, referring to reform-minded Muslims. Quote, the Jews have instilled men and regimes, parenthesis, in the Islamic world, end parenthesis, end quote. Qutb insists. There is a, quote, massive army of agents in the form of professors, philosophers, doctors, and researchers, sometimes also writers, poets, scientists, and journalists, carrying Muslim names because they are of Muslim descent, exclamation point. And some of them are from the ranks of the, quote, Muslim religious authorities, end quote, exclamation point. Kutub. So we see that Kutub considers every Muslim who sympathizes with modernity, even if they are a religious authority, to be a crypto-Jew who will destroy Islam from within. This shows the role anti-Semitism plays in Kutub's thinking. The traditional Islamic image of the, quote, Jew, end quote, has been revitalized and vastly magnified in order to resist the march of modernity in Islamic societies. New section, the Charter of Hamas. A further central document of Islamic anti-Semitism is the Hamas Charter, published in August 1988 against the background of the First Intifada. Wikipedia says, the First Intifada, also known as the First Palestinian Intifada, was a sustained series of non-violent protests, acts of civil disobedience, riots, and terrorist attacks carried out by Palestinians and Palestinian militant groups in the Israeli-occupied Palestinian territories and Israel. The First Intifada was motivated by collective Palestinian frustration over Israel's military occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip as it approached a 20-year mark, having begun in the wake of the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. The uprising lasted from December 1987 until the Madrid Conference of 1991, though some date its conclusion to 1993, the year the Oslo Accords were signed. The Intifada began on the 9th of December 1987 in the Jabalia refugee camp after an Israeli truck driver collided with parked civilian vehicles, killing 4 Palestinian workers, 3 of whom were from the refugee camp. Palestinians charged that the collision was a deliberate response for the killing of an Israeli in Gaza days earlier. Israel denied that the crash, which came at a time of heightened tensions, was intentional or coordinated. The Palestinian response was characterized by protests, civil disobedience, and strikes, with excessive violence in response from Israeli security forces. There was graffiti, barricading, and widespread throwing of stones and Molotov cocktails at the Israeli army and its infrastructure within the West Bank and Gaza Strip. These contrasted with civil efforts, including general strikes, boycotts of the Israeli civil administration institutions in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, an economic boycott consisting of refusal to work in Israeli settlements on Israeli products, refusal to pay taxes, and refusal to drive Palestinian cars with Israeli licenses. Israel deployed some 80,000 soldiers in response. Israeli countermeasures, which included the use of live rounds frequently in case of riots, were criticized by Human Rights Watch as disproportionate, in addition to Israel's excessive use of lethal force. In the first 13 months, 332 Palestinians and 12 Israelis were killed. Images of soldiers beating adolescents with clubs then led to the adoption of firing semi-lethal plastic bullets. During the whole 6-year Intifada, the Israeli army killed at least 1,087 Palestinians, of which 240 were children. Among Israelis, 100 civilians and 60 Israeli soldiers were killed, often by militants outside the control of the Intifada's UNLU, and more than 1,400 Israeli civilians and 1,700 soldiers were injured. Intra-Palestinian violence was also a prominent feature of the Intifada, with widespread executions of an estimated 822 Palestinians killed as alleged Israeli collaborators. Parenthesis, 1988 April to April 1940. Parenthesis, 1988 to April 1994. In parenthesis. At the time, Israel reportedly obtained information from some 18,000 Palestinians who had been compromised, although fewer than half had any proven contact with Israeli authorities. The ensuing Second Intifada took place from September 2000 to 2005. Back to the text. A further central document of Islamic anti-Semitism is the Hamas Charter, published in August 1988 against the background of the First Intifada. In May 2017, Hamas published a more moderate program. Hamas representatives, however, have made it clear that the 1988 version has not been repudiated. Footnote. See the article Dieser Prozess wird scheitern. Spiegel interview with Hamas leader Khaled Mashal in Spiegel 2017. The 2017 document can be found at middleeasteye.net. As with Kutub's text, the Charter too accuses the Jews of wanting to destroy Islam. Here too, behind the hatred of Jews in Israel, lies a call to arms against the spread of liberal ideas in the Islamic world. Once again, the Jews were viewed as pulling the strings. Thus we read that the, quote, Zionist invasion, ... relies greatly in its infiltration and espionage operations on the secret organizations it gave rise to, such as the Freemasons, the Rotary, and Lions Clubs, and other sabotage groups, end quote. Quote, they aim at undermining societies, destroying values, corrupting consciences, and deteriorating character, and annihilating Islam, end quote. A reference to the formative period of Islam appears in almost every one of the document's 36 paragraphs. The Quran is quoted 33 times along with 6 hadiths. Instructions by the Prophet to his companions whose transmission is traced back to the latter. Article 7, for example, cites a well-known hadith to which we shall have occasion to return. Quote, the Prophet, Allah bless him and grant him salvation, has said, quote, the day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, parenthesis, killing the Jews, end parenthesis, when the Jew will hide behind stones and trees. Then stones and trees will say, O Muslims, O Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him. Only the Garkad tree would not do that because it is one of the trees of the Jews, end quote. Parenthesis, related by al-Bukhari and Muslim, end parenthesis. And it says that Wikipedia says, Muhammad al-Bukhari lived from 810 to 870 and was a 9th century Persian Muslim muhaddith, who is widely regarded as the most important hadith scholar in the history of Sunni Islam. Al-Bukhari's extant works include the hadith collection Sahih al-Bukhari, al-Tariq al-Kabir, and al-Adab al-Mufrad. Born in Bukhara in present-day Uzbekistan, al-Bukhari began learning hadith at a young age. Bukhari traveled across the Abbasid Caliphate and learned under several influential contemporary scholars. Bukhari memorized thousands of hadith narrations, compiling the Sahih al-Bukhari in 1846. Bukhari spent the rest of his life teaching the hadith he had collected. Towards the end of his life, Bukhari faced claims the Quran was created and was exiled from Nishapur. Subsequently, al-Bukhari moved to Kartank near Samarkand. Sahih al-Bukhari is revered as the most important hadith collection in Sunni Islam. Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, the hadith collection of al-Bukhari's student, Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj, are together known as Sahihain, or Sahihain, I'm saying that right, and are regarded by Sunnis as the most authentic books after the Quran. It is part of the Kutub al-Sittah, the 6 most highly regarded collections of hadith in Sunni Islam. In Wikipedia, I'm assuming this is what it says. I'm assuming this is what it means when it says al-Bukhari and Muslim. It might be referring to this Muslim ibn al-Hajjaj, commonly known as Imam Muslim, was an Islamic scholar from the city of Nishapur, particularly known as Muhadith, scholar of hadith. His hadith collection, known as Sahih Muslim, is one of the 6 major hadith collections in Sunni Islam, and is regarded as one of the 2 most authentic Sahih and collections, alongside Sahih al-Bukhari. Alright, back to the text. This is an especially cruel hadith. First, allegedly from the mouth of Muhammad, the resurrection of salvation of the Muslims is here made dependent on the murder of Jews. But that is not all. As if not only the Muslims, but the whole universe have conspired against the Jews. Even the stone, symbol of inanimate nature, and the tree, symbol of animate nature, demand that the last terrified hidden Jew be dragged from his hiding place and killed. This saying reproduces the stereotype of the helpless Jew that permeates early Islamic writings. However, only a few lines later, in Article 22 of the Hamas Charter, the Jews are presented as the rulers of the world. Quote, "The Jews were behind the French Revolution, the Communist Revolution, and most of the revolutions we heard and hear about here and there. ... They were behind World War I, when they were able to destroy the Islamic Caliphate. ... They were behind World War II, through which they had made huge financial gains by trading in armaments. ... There is no war going on anywhere without having their finger on it." End quote. Hamas Covenant. In Article 32, Hamas names the source of these fantasies. Quote, "Their plan is embodied in the, quote, protocols of the elders of Zion," end quote, "and their present conduct is the best proof of what we are saying," end quote. This text portrays the Jews in one and the same breath as both weaklings who flee and have to hide behind trees and stones, and at the same time secret and real rulers of the world. The combination is admittedly absurd, but so is anti-Semitism in general. In Islamic anti-Semitism, both components come together and mutually reinforce one another. European anti-Semitism is radicalized through connection with the fanatical aspects of Islam. Anti-Semitically minded Muslims in Germany frequently display their hatred in more direct, aggressive, and violent forms than other actors. And while the stated aim of killing Jews had seemed to be totally discredited after the fall of Nazi Germany, it has been revived by Islamic anti-Semitism, with Muhammad now the alleged model. Just a side note in relation to the absurdity of anti-Semitism, of this kind of like position of this Islamic anti-Semitism, in which the Jews are both this combination of like traditional kind of like a traditional dhimmi view of Jews, coupled with like a Mar type conspiratorial anti-Semitism. How there's like this fearful, all-powerful, but yet fearful, cowardly weaklings, yet all-powerful and mighty at the same time. It should be noted, like the Nazis, for instance, viewed the Jews as dominating both Wall Street and the United States, but also Moscow. That Jews were, in a sense, the vanguard of capitalism and the vanguard of its antithesis. Which is, just goes to show how, poorly concocted and aggressive these ideologies are. And stupid and internally contradictory. Anyway, at the same time, the traditional image of the Jew derived from the Quran has gained a new eliminatory dimension through the admixture of world conspiracy theories. Thus, the warning cry that Jews strive for the, quote, destruction of Islam, end quote, is one of the hallmarks of Islamic antisemitism. But how can the reproach that Jews have wished to destroy Islam be illustrated? How can religious fanatics mobilize people to fight this alleged danger? One of the crucial protagonists of Islamic anti-Semitism had an idea. We're talking about Amin al-Husseini, appointed Mufti of Jerusalem by the British Mandate authorities in Palestine in 1921. How am I doing on time here? Okay. Amin al-Husseini was the first Arab leader of modern times to justify his Jew hatred on religious grounds and to so succeed in reactivating the forces that had long been in abeyance in the Arab world. Religious mobilization. In the 1920s, Amin al-Husseini attempted to turn the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, with its Muslim holy sites, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and the Dome of the Rock, into an emblem of struggle against Zionism. To this end, al-Husseini promoted a complete fabrication. The Jews wanted to destroy these sites in order to erect their third temple on the ruins. In this way, he endeavored to, quote, arouse the religious susceptibilities of the masses, bracket, in Palestine, and bracket, who remained indifferent to nationalistic slogans which are more difficult to understand, end quote. See Uri M. Kupferschmidt, The Supreme Muslim Council, Islam under the British Mandate for Palestine, published in 1987. This book appears to be out of print. Can't find a good description of it. Anyway, back to the text and footnote. At the same time, al-Husseini benefited from the fact that after Mecca and Medina, the Temple Mount is Islam's third most holy site, with the battle cry, quote, Al-Aqsa in danger, end quote. Husseini hoped to mobilize the entire Islamic world against Zionism. I'm going to look up Third Temple. The, quote, Third Temple, end quote, refers to a hypothetical rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. The Third Temple would succeed the First Temple and the Second Temple, and the former having been destroyed during the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem in circa 587 BCE, and later having been destroyed during the Roman siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. The notion of and desire for the Third Temple is sacred in Judaism, particularly in Orthodox Judaism. It would be the most sacred place of worship for Jews. The Hebrew Bible holds that Jewish prophets call for its construction prior to or in tandem with the Messianic age. The building of the Third Temple also plays a major role in some interpretations of Christian eschatology. Among some groups of devout Jews, anticipation of a future project to build the Third Temple at the Temple Mount in the Old City of Jerusalem has been espoused as an ideological motive in Israel. Building the Third Temple has been contested by Muslims due to the existence of the Dome of the Rock, which was built by the Umayyad Caliphate on the site of the destroyed Solomon's Temple and Second Temple. Tensions between Jews and Muslims over the Temple Mount have carried over politically as one of the major flashpoints of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the area has been a subject of significant debate in the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. Most of the international community has refrained from recognizing any sovereignty over Jerusalem due to conflicting territorial claims between Israel and the Palestinian National Authority, as both sides have asserted it as their capital. And the Dome of the Rock is an Islamic shrine at the center of the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound on the Temple Mount in the old city of Jerusalem. The Dome of the Rock is the world's oldest surviving work of Islamic architecture, the earliest archaeologically attested religious structure to be built by a Muslim ruler, and its inscriptions contain the earliest epigraphic proclamations of Islam and of the Islamic prophet Muhammad. The Dome of the Rock's construction was undertaken by the Umayyad Caliphate on the orders of Abd al-Malik during the Second Fitna in 691 to 692 Common Era, and it has been situated on top of the site of the Second Jewish Temple, built in 516 BCE to replace the destroyed Solomon's Temple and rebuilt by Herod the Great, which was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. The original dome collapsed in 1015 and was rebuilt in 1022 to 1023. The Dome of the Rock's architecture and mosaics were patterned after nearby Byzantine churches and palaces. The Dome of the Rock's outside appearance was significantly changed during the early Ottoman period, when brightly colored, mainly blue and white Islamic-style tiles were applied to the exterior, and again in the modern period, notably with the addition of the gold-plated roof. In 1959 to 61 and again in 1993. The octagonal plan of the structure may have been influenced by the Byzantine-era Church of the Seat of Mary, also known as Kathisma in Greek and Al-Qadismu in Arabic, which was built between 451 and 458 on the road between Jerusalem and Bethlehem. The foundation stone, or noble rock, that the temple was built over bears great significance in the Abrahamic religions, as the place where God created the world as well as the first human, Adam. It is also believed to be the site where Abraham attempted to sacrifice his son, and as the place where God's divine presence is manifested more than in any other place, towards which Jews turn during prayer. The site's great significance for Muslims derives from traditions connecting it to the creation of the world, and the belief that the night journey of Muhammad began from the rock at the center of the structure. Designated by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site, Dome of the Rock has been called, quote, Jerusalem's most recognizable landmark, end quote. Along with two nearby Old City structures, the Western Wall and the, quote, Resurrection Rotunda, end quote, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Its Islamic inscriptions proved to be a milestone, as afterward they became a common feature in Islamic structures and almost always mention Muhammad. The Dome of the Rock remains a, quote, unique monument of Islamic culture in almost all respects, end quote, including as a, quote, work of art and as a cultural and pious document, end quote, according to art historian Oleg Grabar. Okay, sorry about that detour. Back to the text. At the same time, al-Husseini benefited from the fact that after Mecca and Medina, the Temple Mount is Islam's third most holy site. With the battle cry, quote, Al-Aqsa in danger, end quote, al-Husseini hoped to mobilize the entire Islamic world against Zionism. This was the aim of the General Islamic Conference that the Mufti organized in December 1931 in Jerusalem, in partnership with the president of the Indian Caliphate movement, Shaukat Ali. This is a very common name, apparently. Shaukat Ali Khan, who lived from 1873 to 1938, was an Indian Muslim member of the Khilafat movement. He was the older brother of the renowned political leader Muhammad Ali Johar. Back to the text. Oh, I should look up this movement that he was part of, too. The Caliphate movement, or the Khilafat movement, from 1919 to 22 was a political campaign launched by Indian Muslims in British India over British policy against Turkey and the planned dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire after World War I by Allied forces. Leaders participating in the movement included Ahmad Sahir Haji Variyama, Maulana Shaukat Ali, Maulana Muhammad Ali Johar, Hakim Ajmal Khan, and Abul Kalam Azad, who organized the movement to redress the grievances of Turkey. Mahatma Gandhi had supported the movement as part of his opposition to the British Empire, and he also advocated for a wider non-cooperation movement at the same time. Vallabhbhai Patel, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and other Hindu and Congress figures also supported the movement. Generally described as a protest against the sanctions placed on the Ottoman Empire after the First World War by the Treaty of Sèvres. The movement is also noted for promoting Hindu-Muslim unity. It ended in 1922 after the end of the non-cooperation movement. Back to the text. The Mufti's goal was to highlight both the global significance of Jerusalem for Muslims and his own importance. While Shaukat Ali did not share al-Husseini's hatred of Jews, it was not Shaukat Ali, but the Mufti who was named president of the conference. Instead of an anticipated 2,000 delegates, only some 150 Muslims from about 20 countries attended, and the conference made no immediate impact. It nonetheless contributed to the spread of anti-Zionism to the wider Islamic world. Footnote. See the article by Thomas Mayer from 1982 titled Egypt and the General Islamic Conference of Jerusalem of 1931. The Wikipedia page for the World Islamic Congress says, the World Islamic Congress was convened in Jerusalem in December 1931 at the behest of Muhammad Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, and Maulana Shaukat Ali, leader of the Indian Caliphate Committee. Ostensibly, the Congress was called to consider a proposal to establish a university at Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem as a center of Islamic scholarship, an idea which the leaders of the prestigious Al-Azhar University in Cairo opposed and which never came to fruition. Attended by 130 delegates from 22 Muslim countries, the Congress called on Muslim states to avoid trade with the Jewish community in Palestine. However, the Congress was viewed widely as an attempt by the Mufti to enhance the Mufti's prestige in advance of a bid for the office of caliph. This position had remained vacant since a Pan-Islamic Congress in Mecca in 1926 had failed to agree on a suitable candidate to replace King Hussein of Hejaz, a rival clan of the Husseinis. The Nashashivis helped to ensure that the Mufti was unsuccessful in his bid for caliphate. Following the election of Husseini as president of the Congress, the agenda was arranged as follows. 1. Holy places and the Barak Wall. 2. The University of Al-Majid Al-Aqsa. 3. The Hejaz Railway. 4. The furtherance of Muslim teaching and culture. 5. Publications. 6. Constitution of the Muslim Congress. 7. Resolutions. The Congress resolved that, quote, Zionism is ipso facto an aggression detrimental to Muslim well-being, and that it is directly or indirectly ousting Muslims from the control of Muslim land and Muslim holy places, end quote. It also resolved that the Congress should meet at intervals of 2 or 3 years, and that resolutions should be enacted by an executive committee chaired by Husseini. Back to the text. The Temple Mount, however, is holy for Jews too. This is the second place where in 950 BCE the Temple of Solomon, and 400 years later the second temple that was destroyed in the year 70 in the Roman-Jewish War had been built. Wikipedia says Solomon's Temple, known as the First Temple, was a biblical temple in Jerusalem believed to have existed between the 10th and 6th centuries BCE. Solomon's Temple's description is largely based on narratives in the Hebrew Bible, in which it was commissioned by biblical King Solomon before being destroyed during the siege of Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar II of the Neo-Babylonian Empire in 587 BCE. No excavations are allowed on the Temple Mount, and no positively identified remains of the destroyed temple have been found. Most modern scholars agree that the first temple existed on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem by the time of the Babylonian siege, and there is a significant debate among scholars over the date of its construction and identity of its builder. The Hebrew Bible, specifically within the Book of Kings, includes a detailed narrative about the construction's ordering by Solomon, the penultimate ruler of the United Kingdom of Israel. It further credits Solomon as the placer of the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, a windowless inner sanctum within the structure. Entry into the Holy of Holies was heavily restricted. The high priest of Israel was the only authority permitted to enter the sanctuary, and only did so on Yom Kippur, carrying the blood of a sacrificial lamb and burning incense. In addition to serving as a religious building for worship, the first temple has also functioned as a place of assembly for the Israelites. The first temple's destruction and subsequent Babylonian captivity were both events that were seen as a fulfillment of biblical prophecies and thus affected Judaic religious beliefs, precipitating the Israelites' transition from either polytheism to monolatrism, as seen in Yahwism, to firm Jewish monotheism. Bracket original research question mark and bracket. Previously, many scholars accepted the biblical narrative of the first temple's construction by Solomon as authentic. During the 1980s, skeptical approaches to the biblical text as well as the archaeological record led some scholars to doubt whether there was any temple in Jerusalem constructed as early as the 10th century BCE. Some scholars have suggested that the original structure built by Solomon was relatively modest and was later built on a larger scale. No direct evidence for the existence of Solomon's temple has been found. Due to the extreme religious and political sensitivity of the site, no recent archaeological excavations have been conducted on the Temple Mount. 19th and early 20th century excavations around the Temple Mount did not identify, quote, even a trace, end quote, of the complex. The house of Yahweh Astrakhan, dated to the 6th century BCE, may refer to the first Temple Mount. Two 21st century findings from the Israelite period in present-day Israel bear resemblance to Solomon's temple as it is described in the Hebrew Bible, a shrine model from the early half of the 10th century BCE in Khirbet Qeiyafa, and the Tel Matzah Temple, dated to the 9th century BCE and located in the neighborhood of Matzah within West Jerusalem. The biblical description of Solomon's temple also appears to share similarities with several Syro-Hittite temples of the same period discovered in modern-day Syria and Turkey, such as those in Ain Dara and Tel Teanat. Following Jewish return from exile, Solomon's temple was replaced by the Second Temple. The Second Temple was the temple in Jerusalem that replaced Solomon's temple, which was destroyed during the Babylonian siege of Jerusalem in 587 BCE. It was constructed around 516 BCE and later enhanced by Herod the Great around 18 BCE, consequently also being known as Herod's Temple thereafter, defining the Second Temple period and standing as a pivotal symbol of Jewish identity. It was the basis and namesake of Second Temple Judaism. The Second Temple served as the chief place of worship, ritual sacrifice, korban, and communal gathering for the Jewish people, among whom it regularly attracted pilgrims of the three pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot. In 539 BCE, the Persian conquest of Babylon enabled the Achaemenid Empire to expand across the Fertile Crescent by annexing the Neo-Babylonian Empire, including the territory of the former Kingdom of Judah, which had been annexed as the Babylonian province of Yehud during the reign of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II, who concurrently exiled part of Judah's population to Babylon. Following this campaign, the Persian king Cyrus the Great issued the, quote, Edict of Cyrus, end quote, parentheses, sometimes identified with the Cyrus cylinder, end parentheses, which is described in the Hebrew Bible as a royal proclamation that authorized and encouraged the repatriation of displaced populations in the region. This event is called the Return to Zion in Ezra Nehemiah, marking the resurgence of Jewish life in what had become the self-governing Persian province of Yehud. The reign of the Persian king Darius the Great saw the completion of the Second Temple, signifying a period of renewed Jewish hope and religious revival. According to the biblical account, the Second Temple was originally a relatively modest structure built under the authority of the Persian-appointed Jewish governor Zerubbabel, who was the grandson of the penultimate Judahite king Jessoniah. In the 1st century BCE, Herod's efforts to transform the Second Temple resulted in a grand and imposing structure and courtyard, including the large edifices and facades shown in modern models, such as the Holy Land model of Jerusalem in the Israel Museum. The Temple Mount, where both Solomon's Temple and the Second Temple stood, was also significantly expanded, doubling in size to become the ancient world's largest religious sanctuary. In 700 Common Era, at the height of the First Jewish-Roman War, the Second Temple was destroyed by the Roman siege of Jerusalem, resulting in a cataclysmic shift in Jewish history. The loss of the Second Temple prompted the development of Rabbinic Judaism, which remains the mainstream form of Jewish religious practices globally. All right. Thank you for that detour. I'm dumb, so I need to learn these things. The Wailing Wall, Judaism's most important place of prayer, is a remnant of the walls that supported the temple. Following the Islamic conquest of Palestine, Around 690, the famous Dome of the Rock, with its dome later gilded, was erected on this plaza to be followed a few years later by the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The close proximity here of Jewish and Muslim places of prayer offers great scope for provocations. In an open letter of 1928, the leadership of the Palestinian Jews pledged never to disrespect the religious rights of Muslims on the Temple Mount, but to no avail. Footnote. See Nadav Sorgai. The quote, Al-Aqsa is in danger, Bible, the history of a lie. The description of this book says, the modern blood libel, quote, Al-Aqsa is in danger, end quote, referring to the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, originated in the days of Grand Mufti Haj Amin al-Husseini, ally of Hitler, and is propagated today by Sheikh Raed Salah, Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, and many others in the Muslim world, now that it has come to be regarded as unalloyed truth by millions in the Muslim world. It is urgent to address this lie. Back to the text. End footnote. In 1929, the Mufti circulated forged photos of an arson attack on Al-Aqsa Mosque. Footnote. See Jenny Lebel, the Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini and National Socialism, published in Belgrade in 2007. The description of this book says, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who lived from 1895 to 1974, self-proclaimed Grand Mufti, a non-existent invented title, of Jerusalem, was one of the greatest international criminals in the first half of the 20th century. Under the guise of religious activities, Haj Amin al-Husseini in fact incited and organized violence, including murders, first against the Jews in Palestine and the British Mandatory Power, as well as against his Arab rivals. During World War II, after the Mufti escaped from Palestine via Iraq to Europe, the Mufti collaborated with Italian fascists and especially closely and intensively with German Nazis. Haj Amin al-Husseini helped the latter in recruiting Bosnian, Albanian, and former Soviet Union Muslims for their Waffen SS divisions, which fought against the Allies and against local populations in the occupied territories, committing terrible atrocities. Haj Amin al-Husseini was an active propagandist against the Allies and also organized spying networks against them in Africa and the Middle East. Haj Amin al-Husseini played many parts, but his whole life was dedicated to the fight against Jewish immigration and to the persecution and extermination of Jews in Palestine and all over Europe. Haj Amin al-Husseini aborted a promising attempt to save a number of Jewish children, who were then killed. At the end of the war, the Mufti succeeded in escaping Germany and was not arrested and prosecuted by the Allies, although they could have done it. Haj Amin al-Husseini finally arrived in Egypt in 1946 and continued his activities, which included organizing murders of political opponents like the president of Lebanon and King Abdullah of Jordan. Haj Amin died in his Beirut home on the 4th of July 1974. Prominent among his family mourners was Yasser Arafat. The book contains about 100 pictures and original documents collected in extensive research, about 700 notes with historical and literary references, an extensive bibliography and index of names. Anyway, back to the text and footnote. Haj Amin al-Husseini's call to defend the holy places led to the Hebron massacre, in which 133 Jews were killed and 339 wounded. The Hebron massacre was the killing of 67 or 69 Jews on the 24th of August 1929 in Hebron, Mandatory Palestine. The event also left scores seriously wounded or maimed. Jewish homes were pillaged and synagogues were ransacked. So there's a discrepancy between what is being said in Küntzel and what's being said on the Wikipedia page. You should take Wikipedia. I would take Wikipedia with a grain of salt, bigger grain of salt than Küntzel. The massacre was perpetrated by Arabs, incited to violence by rumors that Jews were planning to seize control of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. Some of the 435 Jews in Hebron who survived were hidden by local Arab families, although the extent of this phenomenon is debated. Soon after, all Hebron's Jews were evacuated by the British authorities. Many returned in 1931, but almost all were evacuated at the outbreak of the 1936-39 Arab revolt in Palestine. The massacre formed part of the 1929 Palestine riots, in which a total of 133 Jews and 110 Arabs were killed, most of the latter by British security forces, and brought the centuries-old Jewish presence in Hebron to an end. The Hebron massacre, together with that of Jews in Safed, sent shockwaves through Jewish communities in Palestine and around the world. It led to the reorganization and development of the Jewish paramilitary organization, the Haganah, which later became the nucleus of the Israeli Defense Forces. So there's not a discrepancy. There's just a difference of names. So I guess, yeah. In the following years, the Egyptian Brotherhood took up the cry, quote, "O you young men, the English soldiers and Jewish police are defiling the Dome of the Rock," end quote. Claims a leaflet distributed in Cairo in October 1938, quote, "They are destroying its dome and walls. As a result of this terrible torture and mutilation, the Arabs in the Holy Land are in danger of destruction, ... The jihad for Palestine has become a holy and God-desired duty," end quote. Footnote. See Gudrum Kremer, Minderheit, Millet, Nation, Die Juden in Ägypten, 1914 to 1952. Published in 1982. I'm not finding any straight up descriptions of this book. See a review of it. Anyway. Oh, it looks like there's an English translation. The Jews in Modern Egypt, 1914 to 1952, by Gudrun Kremer. Gudrun Kremer is a professor of Islamic Studies, chair of the Institute of Islamic Studies at the Free University of Berlin. Back to the text. During World War II, al-Husseini continued to spread rumors about the Al-Aqsa Mosque in his radio talks in Arabic on the Nazi shortwave radio station. In 1943, for example, he fulminated about, quote, the greed of the Jews for the Islamic holy places, and the Jews wished to build a Jewish temple in the place of the blessed Al-Aqsa Mosque, end quote. Haj Amin al-Husseini. Footnote. See Gerhard Hupp's edited volume Mufti Papira Briefe Memoranden Reden und Aufrufe Amin al-Husseinis aus dem Exil, 1940 to 1945. Not seeing any good descriptions of this book. Back to the text. And footnote. However, after Jordan took control of East Jerusalem, which includes the Old Town and Temple Mount, in the 1948 war, Jerusalem suddenly lost its allure. There was no more interest in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. From 1948 to 1967, when the Temple Mount, parenthesis, Haram al-Sharif, end parenthesis, was under full Arab control, the only Arab leader to visit was the Moroccan king. For Jews, this was a difficult time. During the nearly 20 years of Jordanian occupation, the Jews were forbidden from praying at the Wailing Wall. All Jewish synagogues, schools, and cemeteries were destroyed. One second. I just want to read if there's any Wikipedia stuff for this. It says on the Wailing Wall Wikipedia, it says, during the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the Old City together with the wall was controlled by Jordan. Article 8 of the 1949 Armistice Agreement called for a special committee to make arrangements for, parenthesis, amongst other things, in parenthesis, quote, free access to the holy places and cultural institutions and use of the cemetery on the Mount of Olives, end quote. The committee set multiple times during 1949, but both sides made additional demands. And at the same time, the Palestine Conciliation Commission was pressing for the internationalization of Jerusalem against the wishes of both parties. No agreement was ever reached, leading to recriminations in both directions. Neither Israeli Arabs nor Israeli Jews could visit their holy places in the Jordanian territories. An exception was made for Christians to participate in Christmas ceremonies in Bethlehem. Some sources claim Jews could only visit the wall if they traveled through Jordan, parenthesis, which was not an option for Israelis, end parenthesis, and did not have an Israeli visa stamped in their passports. Only Jordanian scholars and tourists were to be found there. A vantage point on Mount Zion from which the wall could be viewed became the place where Jews gathered to pray. For thousands of pilgrims, the Mount, being the closest location to the wall under Israeli control, became a substitute site for the traditional priestly blessing ceremony which takes place on the 3 pilgrimage festivals. Quote, Al-Barak, parenthesis, Wailing Wall, in parenthesis, road, in quote, sign. During the Jordanian rule of the Old City, a ceramic street sign in Arabic and English was affixed to the stones on the ancient wall. Attached 20.1 meters up to, it was made up of 8 separate ceramic tiles and Al-Barak Road in Arabic at the top with the English, quote, Al-Barak, parenthesis, Wailing Wall, in parenthesis, road, end quote, below. When Israeli soldiers arrived at the wall in 1967, one attempted to scrawl Hebrew lettering on it. The Post-Jerusalem Post reported that on the 8th of June, Ben-Gurion went to the wall and, quote, looked at this taste, and, quote, at the road sign, quote, this is not right, it should come down, end quote, and he proceeded to dismantle it. This act signaled the climax of the capture of the Old City and the ability of Jews to once again access their holiest sites. Emotional recollections of this event are related by David Ben-Gurion and Shimon Peres. So I was looking for particularly for this destruction of synagogues, but I don't know. Jordan was not a member of the United Nations when the vote on the United Nations partition plan for Palestine of 1947 was taken, but following the establishment of the State of Israel on the 14th of May 1948, Jordan, then known as Transjordan, was one of the Arab League countries that immediately attacked the new country, precipitating the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. By war's end, Jordan had control of the West Bank and East Jerusalem, including the Old City, and expelled those Jews who remained in the Old City of Jerusalem. An Arab commander remarked, quote, for the first time in 1,000 years, not a single Jew remains in the Jewish quarter. Not a single building remains intact. This makes the Jews' return here impossible, end quote. The Hurva synagogue, originally built in 1701, was blown up by the Jordanian Arab Legion. In 1950, Jordan annexed the West Bank and East Jerusalem, and in 1954 granted Jordanian nationality to its non-Jewish residents who had been Palestinian nationals before 15th of May 1948. During the 19 years of Jordanian rule in the West Bank, a third of the Jewish quarters buildings were demolished. According to a complaint Israel made to the United Nations, all but one of the 35 Jewish houses of worship in the Old City were destroyed. The synagogues were razed or pillaged and stripped of their interiors used as hen houses or stables. Jordan lost control of the West Bank during the 1967 Six-Day War, but did not relinquish its claim to the West Bank until 1988, and in 1994 signed the Israel-Jordan Treaty of Peace. The treaty did not change the status of Jews in Jordan, and in 2006 it was reported that there were no Jewish citizens of Jordan, nor any synagogues or other Jewish institutions. Nevertheless, the government does recognize Judaism as a religion and does not impose restrictions on Jews, and Jews are permitted to own property and conduct business in the country, though these may be subject to Jordanian nationality requirements. Okay. So that's a piece of history I knew nothing about. So there we are. Back to the text. And then in July 1967, in the course of the Six-Day War, Israel won possession of the Old City, including the Temple Mount. Now the Jews could have paid the Arabs back in their own coin, destruction of religious objects, and a ban on Muslims praying on the Temple Mount. However, that is not what happened. Instead, at the time, Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan, the guy with the eye patch, laid down the rules that have remained in force ever since. First, the Temple Mount was to remain under Jordanian administration and serve as a place of prayer for Muslims. Second, Israel's sole responsibility would pertain to the safety of the Mount's access points. And third, while Jews would be granted entry to the sites, Jews would be forbidden to pray there. So this most important of Jewish holy places is the only one where Jews are forbidden to pray. Today, only a small group of ultra-Orthodox Jews refuse to accept this restriction, calling for the Temple Mount to be reclaimed by the Jews and a third Jewish temple constructed. They are a marginal force in Israeli society, and Dayan's ad hoc arrangements have become set in legal stone. Nevertheless, Muslim and Arab authorities launched a new religious campaign, this time denying the connection between Judaism and Jerusalem. Of course, no serious historian or archaeologist doubts the close relationship between the people and the place. This did not, however, stop Yasser Arafat asserting in 2000 that there had never been a Jewish temple in Jerusalem, proclaiming that, quote, I myself visited Yemen and was shown the site where the Temple of Solomon existed, end quote. Jesus Christ. Countless Arab sources show the extent to which the notion that Jews have no connection with Jerusalem has taken root. So Mahmoud al-Habash, a senior advisor to President Mahmoud Abbas, talked in 2018 of the, quote, Arab, Muslim, and Christian identity of Jerusalem. Stating that the Jews were, quote, stating that the Jews are, claiming territory based on a false Jewish or biblical pretext whose sole purpose is to take over the land. The Al-Barak Wall, bracket, i.e. the Western Wall, end bracket, has nothing to do with a bracket Jewish temple, end bracket, and bracket the Jews, end bracket, have no right over its stones. This is an imperialist myth, end quote. Mahmoud al-Habash. Abbas himself repeated this lie at the end of 2017 in a speech to the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, OIC, where Abbas described Jerusalem as a, quote, Palestinian Arab Muslim Christian city, end quote. That is, with no connection to the Jews. Abbas's view was supported by a Jordanian professor of archaeology, Mohammed Wahib al-Husseini. Quote, the, bracket, Israelites, and bracket, are unable to convince anyone anywhere in the world that they have a historic right to this blessed land. They did not have existence in history in Palestine, and especially not in Jerusalem, end quote. Footnote. See MEMRI, quote, article, Jordanian archaeologist Muhammad Wahib al-Husseini, the Jews have no historic right to the land. The Zionist movement wants to rule the world, end quote. And footnote. Behind this denial of Jewish history lies a new dimension of Jew hatred expressed through the falsification of historical facts. in the spirit of Holocaust denial. One would be inclined to laugh at such nonsense, but those who promote it are in earnest. Here, a new front in the religious war has been opened, a new fuel poured on the fire of Islamic antisemitism. For just as like Holocaust denial, temple denial requires acceptance of the existence of a vast Jewish conspiracy, in which the Jews, using their power over politics and media, effectively suppress the, quote, real truth, end quote, about Jerusalem. But let us return to the alarm cry, quote, Al-Aqsa in danger, end quote. To this day, throughout the Arab world, one finds cartoons in which loathsome serpents and squid-like creatures, all bearing the Star of David, cling to the Al-Aqsa Mosque or Dome of the Rock, or in which we see Jews in the form of rats undermining the shrines, or ghostly obese figures devouring the Dome of the Rock. In July 2017, it became apparent how effective this agitation has been. On the 14th of July 2017, 3 Israeli Arabs succeeded in smuggling weapons onto Temple Mount and shooting 2 Israeli policemen at one of the Mount's crossing points. One second. Wikipedia says on the 14th of July 2017, 3 Arab Israeli men left the Temple Mount, known as the Noble Sanctuary, and opened fire on Israeli border police officers stationed near the Gate of the Tribes, which is close to the Lion's Gate. 2 Israeli border police officers were killed and 2 more injured in the attack. All 3 attackers were shot and killed by Israeli police after fleeing back into the complex. Back to the text. Thereafter, Israel set about installing metal detectors, a process which entailed a 2-day ban on entry to the Temple Mount. The Palestinian propaganda machine then went into overdrive to create the false impression that the metal detectors were part of a secret plan to wage a religious war against the Muslims and destroy the mosques. In 19th of July 2017 was designated a, quote, Day of Rage, end quote. Quote, on this day we must come out on great demonstrations in all Arab towns, end quote, demanded Abbas Zaki, a member of the Fatah Central Committee. Wikipedia says Abbas Zaki is the former representative of the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, in Lebanon and a member of Fatah's Central Committee. The Turkish government denounced the 2-day closure of the Temple Mount as a, quote, crime against humanity, end quote. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan summoned the world's Muslims to play an active part in the defense of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. While in Istanbul, demonstrators besieged the Nev Shalom synagogue and pelted it with various objects. Al-Qaeda called for armed resistance. The Iranian regime did not want to miss the party. It supplied tens of thousands of demonstrators in Jerusalem with food and drink, and a message of support from its supreme guide, Ali Khamenei. The hysteria over the imaginary destruction of the Al-Aqsa Mosque inspired a 19-year-old Palestinian to break into the house of a Jewish family and stab 3 people to death. Meanwhile, 4 Arabs were killed in clashes with Israeli security forces. Only after Israel backed down and dismantled the metal detectors did this nightmare reach a temporary end. When a few months later, U.S. President Donald Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, the show resumed. The Palestinian authorities once again played the religious card, condemning Trump's decision as, quote, aggression against Islam, ... aggression against the Quran, ... aggression against the Muslims, ... aggression against the Al-Aqsa Mosque, ... and aggression against humanity, end quote. Footnote. Trump also declared in his statement of the 6th of December 2017 that this step did not affect the legal status of the divided city, whose final settlement depended on an agreement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. End footnote. Footnote. Palestinian Media Watch, PMW, article. Abbas advisor incites religious war. Bulletin, 13th of December 2017. With a nod towards the Christian blood libel, Recep Tayyip Erdogan again poured fuel on the fire. Quote, the fate of Jerusalem cannot be left in the hands of a country that nourishes itself in blood, end quote. In his capacity as chairman of the OIC, Recep Tayyip Erdogan organized a special OIC summit in Istanbul in order to set, quote, the whole Islamic world in motion. To no effect. The protests against the recognition of Jerusalem amounted to a storm in a teacup. However, while the Arab Street in Cairo and Riyadh remained quiet, radicalized Muslims in cities such as London and Berlin erupted in fury. Quote, Jerusalem belongs to all Muslims of the Ummah of this world, to no one else, end quote, proclaimed one of the slogans at a demonstration at Berlin's Brandenburg Gate. The U.S. president with this decision, quote, had declared war not only on the Palestinians but on all Muslims, end quote. In addition, according to the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, the demonstrators yelled in Arabic, quote, death to Israel, end quote. Quote, Kebar, Yahud, Deshesh, Muhammad, Sayadu, end quote. Parenthesis, quote, Khaybar, O you Jews, Muhammad's army will soon return, end quote, end parenthesis. ... In addition, Hamas headbands flags of Islamic Hezbollah, a burning cloth decorated with a Star of David, ... Similar rallies took place throughout Germany, ... In Dusseldorf, the Israeli flag was spat and trampled on amid calls for an intifada. The Khaybar rhyme was also heard in Koblenz. In Mainz, maps from which Israel had been erased were shown. End quote. See the article by Justus Bender, Nix gegen Juden aber, in FAZ, 14th of December 2017. Of course, the few thousand participants in these events comprised only a tiny minority of Germany's Muslim population, and of those participants only a minority shouted anti-Semitic slogans. Nonetheless, the anti-Jewish frenzy of this minority was sufficiently vehement to elicit a response from politicians and the media in Germany. A motion proposed by all major parties of the Bundestag condemned the, quote, anti-Israel rallies in December 2017 at the Brandenburg Gate, end quote, as, quote, unacceptable, end quote. According to the statement, freedom of expression and demonstration in Germany leaves, quote, no room for anti-Semitic incitement and violence, end quote. On the one hand, the statement does not downplay the threat of, quote, an anti-Semitism reinforced by immigration, end quote. On the contrary, it emphasizes that, quote, the unrestricted acceptance of Jewish life, end quote, is, quote, a measure of successful integration, end quote, and deems, quote, anti-Semitic hate calls, end quote, a behavior that justifies a, quote, especially serious interest in deportation, end quote. On the other hand, words such as, quote, Muslim, or, quote, Islam, or, quote, Islamic antisemitism, end quote, are nowhere to be found in this lengthy document, nor do we find any mention of the encouragement of Jew hatred by Turkish, Iranian, or other Middle Eastern mass media. Indeed, use of the term, quote, Islamic antisemitism, end quote, was shunned not only by the political class, but by professional antisemitism experts. This attitude was expressed in the most radical fashion by Wolfgang Benz, the former long-standing head of the Berlin Center for Research on Antisemitism. Wolfgang Benz doubts whether there is such thing as Islamic antisemitism at all. The widespread anti-Semitism among Muslims has absolutely nothing to do with religion. Wolfgang Benz declared in 2018, quote, the enmity of Muslims towards Jews is not based on the Quran. Religion-based Jew hatred characterized Christianity for 2,000 years, but not Islam, end quote. And Wolfgang Benz then readies himself for a counterattack on those who disagree with him. Dangerous, quote, fanatics, who stir up the public with the construct of a genuine Muslim anti-Semitism, that is, hostility to Jews derived from the theological premises of Islam, end quote. A more sophisticated, end quote, Wolfgang Benz. The more sophisticated argument is that of Islam scholar Michael Kiefer. Not seeing anything on this person. Michael Kiefer proposed the term, quote, Islamized anti-Semitism, end quote, on the grounds that what we have here is, quote, anti-Semitism with an Islamic veneer, end quote. That, quote, in all important structural elements is identical with modern European anti-Semitism, end quote. In this version, the radicalizing and mobilizing contribution of religion is downplayed and depicted as providing no more than a form of concealment. Another term on offer is, quote, Islamist anti-Semitism, end quote, which suggests that this form of Jew hatred is found only among Islamists. Here too, however, the dogma that in this case Islamic beliefs are merely being instrumentalized for political ends misses the mark. For conservative Muslims, religion is not a means but an end. By taking particular stipulations from the Quran and Hadiths literally, they feel themselves to be the most faithful followers of Allah. It's hard to talk about, quote, instrumentalization, end quote, in this context. The problem, therefore, is those stipulations themselves that, quote, anti-Semitic dross, end quote, in which Mesri Haddad referred. To which Mesri Haddad referred. Scholarly work begins with terminological precision. The term, quote, Islamic anti-Semitism, end quote, defines a specific variant of anti-Semitism whose reach extends far beyond the Islamist camp and mobilizes the religious potential for Jew hatred present in Islam. In fact, we are dealing here with a religious war, a form of war that, apart from the troubles in Northern Ireland, has not been seen in our time since the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648. In the first place, we have the transcendental aspect. Only in religious wars do the martyrdom ideology and belief in paradise find expression. Quote, each drop of blood that was spilled in Jerusalem is pure blood as long as it's for the sake of Allah. Every shaheed, martyr, will be in heaven, and every wounded person will be rewarded by Allah's will, end quote. As even the reputedly moderate leader of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, put it. Footnote. See the article by Khaled Abu Toameh titled Abbas, quote, Israelis have no right to desecrate our holy sites at their dirty feet, end quote. Jerusalem Post, 16th of September, 2015. End footnote. Here, too, we find the second mass mobilizing aspect. Religion is seen as the only means capable of moving the world's 1.7 billion Muslims as a united, quote, Muslim nation, end quote, into action against the 14 million Jews. And finally, there is the totalitarian aspect. In the final battle between the party of God and the party of Satan, quote, humanity will be relieved of their, bracket, the Jews, and bracket, presence, since subsequently not one Jew will remain alive, end quote, as Islamist writings put it. Footnote. See the article by Esther Webman. Quote, From the Damascus blood libel to the, quote, Arab Spring, end quote, the evolution of Arab anti-Semitism, end quote, published in Anti-Semitism Studies, Volume 1, Number 1, Spring 2017. End footnote. Why do so many Muslims in Europe support this war? The conventional answer is that it is because they or their ancestors have come from countries where anti-Semitism is commonplace. This contains an important truth. We cannot begin to understand Islamic anti-Semitism if we restrict our attention to Germany or the European Union. It is essential that we take into account the Arab Islamic world, with which many European Muslims are connected in multiple ways. Through family ties, access to Arabic or Turkic mass media, or a sense of solidarity with Israel's Middle Eastern adversaries. The broader view, however, simply raises the same question on a larger scale. Why is anti-Semitism rampant in these regions? How is it that only a few years after the Holocaust, extreme Jew hatred was so widespread? There is a well-established answer. Because of Israel. In fact, however, admiration for Hitler and Rommel and hatred of Jews were already strong before the founding of the Jewish state in 1948. Indeed, after 1945, the Arab world was the only region in the world in which a pro-Nazi past remained a source of pride rather than shame. But why? To explain this phenomenon, we need to take a new look at a specific facet of recent history. The influence of the Nazis on events in the Middle East in the period between 1937 and 1948, and notably the impact of the Nazis' Arab language anti-Semitic propaganda effort during those years. Therefore, in order to explain Islamic anti-Semitism adequately, we must take into account not only its geographical but its historical context. That is what we will attempt to do in the next 3 chapters. They illuminate an aspect of the German past that is commonly overlooked, and show, drawing on new archival discoveries, how the Nazis succeeded in embedding Islamic anti-Semitism in the Arab world. This new view of Middle Eastern history gives us a clearer picture of the present. Only if we realize how strongly modern Middle Eastern history has been shaped by the impact of National Socialism can we correctly interpret the Jew hatred in this region and its resonance among Muslims in Europe and develop effective countermeasures. That's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.